The anime begins with a young girl, Kathleen Fanada, recording a video of herself. With a sense of urgency in her voice, she explains that she is leaving proof of her existence because in the year 2030, a deadly disease called gibbet will ravage the world, starting in Venice, Italy. As the scenes shift, Kathleen speaks of how the disease has dramatically altered the course of human history in just 2 short years. Back to 1600 AD Japan, where a storm rages in the night. 2 men, Kanzaki Sensei and Sanada Kenroku, are seen on a boat, both of whom have been exiled from Edo. Kenroku recognizes Sensei and asks about the reason for his exile. Sensei reveals that he was asked to take the fall by his master, who promised to call him back once the exile was over. Kenroku also has a tale of his own. He was living a life with a woman until he was arrested for killing an evil shogun. As Kenroku faced his impending execution, he chose to accept exile instead. But as their boat was tossed by sudden, tumultuous waves, a light from the sea enveloped them. When they awoke, they found themselves in a desolate and destroyed version of Tokyo in the year 2030. At first, they believed they had entered the afterlife, with one of the towering buildings in the distance appearing as a palace. As they explored their surroundings, Kenroku and Sensei encountered a solitary figure seated amidst the ruins. Approaching him with caution, they were shocked when the man transformed into a monstrous creature. Then Sensei grabbed a piece of iron in an attempt to defend himself, but the weapon was ineffective. After that, Kenroku used a fire extinguisher as a weapon, striking the monster with it, but to no avail. As Kenroku attempted to engage the monster, he discovered that it was slower than he expected. Just as the creature advanced on them, Kathleen and a man named Maeda arrived to their rescue. Without hesitation, she pulled out a gun and fired bullets that ensnared and electrocuted the monster, rendering it defeated. Quickly collecting its blood, she beckoned for Sensei and Kenroku to join her in the car. As they drove away, Kenroku marveled at the speed of the vehicle, remarking that it was like a high-speed horse. Sensei, meanwhile, asked Kathleen if they were in the afterlife. She explained that they were actually in Tokyo and asked where they both came from. Maeda was taken aback by their old-fashioned clothing, and Kenroku revealed that before arriving in Tokyo, they had been on a boat, leaving Edo. This information stunned Kathleen, leading her to suspect that Sensei and Kenroku were samurai. Then Maeda reveals to Kenroku and Sensei that Tokyo is the future version of Edo. Kathleen adds that many centuries have passed since the Edo period and Japan has remained at peace for the past 80 years. However, the recent outbreak of the infectious disease called gibbet has changed everything. The disease causes those infected to turn into monsters. Upon hearing this, Kenroku panics as he remembers the monster they encountered earlier, wondering if he too has been infected. Kathleen calms Kenroku by informing him that as long as they avoid getting stung by gibbet, they won't become infected. When Maeda learns that Sensei is a samurai, he asks about his katana. Sensei reveals that he only came with the clothes on his back. On the other hand, Kenroku mentions that he is a shinobi and doesn't need a katana to fight. Maeda then asks about Sensei's fighting skills as a samurai. Kenroku explains that Sensei was once known as a killer of thousands. Upon realizing his strength, Maeda offers to retrieve a katana from his house. He asks Kathleen to take over driving the car and return to the camp while he retrieves the weapon. Not long after their arrival, Kathleen, Sensei, and Kenroku were greeted by Brian, an American soldier. The people at the camp were taken aback by the ancient clothing that Sensei and Kenroku were wearing. Shortly after, Kathleen greeted her mother, Eureka, and informed her that she had brought a samurai and a ninja with her. However, Eureka's lack of surprise caused Kenroku to feel confused. Then Kathleen explained that her mother's soul had been damaged, causing her to be unable to distinguish between gibbet and humans. Kathleen then took Sensei and Kenroku to meet Dr. Yoshinaga, who was accompanied by another American soldier, Adam. Adam expressed his disbelief at the idea of samurai and ninja traveling through time, reminding Kathleen that many people have gone mad in the current situation. He also judged that Sensei and Kenroku may be suffering from mental disorders. Adam warned Kathleen to keep a close eye on Sensei and Kenroku, fearing that they may steal something. After Adam left to gather supplies, Yoshinaga introduced himself and explained that gibbet was a disease that turned humans into animals. Despite the strange nature of the disease, he believed in Sensei and Kenroku's story of time travel. Upon hearing that Sensei had been hit by a monster's attack, Yoshinaga asked if he had heard the sound of water dripping in his head. If not, he would not be infected. Sensei relieved Kathleen by saying that he had not heard such a sound. Yoshinaga revealed that he was currently researching a drug that could turn those infected with gibbet back into humans. Kathleen then gave him the blood sample of gibbet she had obtained earlier. At night, they turned on the lights in the camp, as Yoshinaga explained that gibbet did not like light. Meanwhile, Maeda had retrieved his katana from his home. On the other hand, Kathleen recorded Sensui, asking him to share his story as a samurai and demonstrate his sword skills. Then he began by explaining that he was adopted by a foreign swordsman at a young age and taught the swordsmanship of the West. So Sensui was just 15 when he was taken in by his master and sent to the Nenryu dojo to train in the art of fighting with 2 katanas. He was accompanied by Kathleen and Kenroku as they explored the camp housing area. There, she informed them that only 50 people remained and that they had all turned into gibiate. Kathleen was eager to test Sensui's strength and challenged him to a kendo match. However, Sensui was initially hesitant, but she reminded him that if he was truly a samurai, he must prove himself in the face of danger. After accepting the challenge, he effortlessly defeated her, impressing her with his skill. He explained to her that a true samurai never dulls their blade by bumping it in battle, a lesson that she took to heart. As a reward for his victory, Kathleen helped Sensui and Kenroku dress more stylishly. To Kenroku's surprise, his hair had turned blue, making him easily recognizable from a distance. While Kathleen complimented him on his unique look, he was apprehensive, believing that standing out would make him a target. After that, Sensui and his companions visited Eureka to treat a wound on his hand sustained during an attack by the gibiate. Sensui, curious about his master, Matsumoto Jozan, asked Eureka about him. She consulted a Japanese history book and delivered the devastating news that Jozan had betrayed Sensui and was eventually beheaded. Meanwhile, Maeda was being pursued by gibiate tails in the form of spiders. Then Adam and Brian sprang into action, using searchlights and gunfire to fend off the monsters. However, Kathleen grew increasingly worried about Sensui, who had become uncharacteristically quiet after learning of Jozan's fate. Then Kenroku explained to her that Sensui felt a deep sense of guilt and regret for not being by Jozan's side in his final moments. Shortly after, Sensui left the building, lost in thought and grappling with his emotions. Just then, Maeda arrived, brandishing his katana. Suddenly, the camp's electricity went out, causing panic among the residents due to the imminent threat of gibiate attacks. Soon after, Yoshinaga tasked Kathleen with rescuing her mother and asked Kenroku to help defend the camp. Sensui watched in disbelief as the gibiates descended upon the helpless people. Then Maeda offered him his katana, encouraging him to take up arms and defend their community. With the situation becoming more and more dire, Sensui sprang into action, using his skills and weapons to battle the invading gibiates. As he fought, he made a promise to Maeda to bring him to Eureka for treatment, and he fought with all his might to make good on that promise. While Sensui fought at the front lines, Kenroku and Yoshinaga worked to protect the camp residents. They directed the people to gather in a safe place, and proposed burning the tents to drive away the gibiates. Meanwhile, Kathleen raced to her mother's side, using her powers to save her from the clutches of a gibiate. Despite the efforts of Sensui and the others, the defensive line was rapidly being overwhelmed. The bullets of the defenders could not penetrate the skin of the gibiates, but Kenroku was quick thinking, using a cable to strangle one of the monsters. At the front gate, Adam struggled to hold back the tide of monsters, but Sensui arrived just in time, cutting down the gibiate that threatened to attack Adam. With the situation becoming more dire by the moment, Sensui took control of the defensive line, commanding Adam and Brian to find Kathleen. Adam was still harboring resentment towards Sensui, but was finally compelled to comply when Brian pressed the matter. It wasn't long before Kenroku and Yoshinaga arrived on the scene, and were astounded by Sensui's mastery of the katana as he fought against the gibiates. When Sensui came across a gibiate too powerful to defeat with his sword alone, Kenroku stepped in and threw a grenade to illuminate the creature's weak point, allowing Sensui to strike the killing blow. The group continued to fight off the gibiates until dawn, but their victory was bittersweet. Maeda had been infected, and as he started to hear the telltale dripping sounds, he expressed his happiness at having met a great samurai like Sensui before asking him to end his life before he became a gibiate. Maeda's death was a devastating blow, and even Kathleen, usually so stoic, was unable to hold back her tears. Later, Kathleen interviewed Kenroku, who revealed himself as the youngest descendant of the Sanada clan. He left the clan to be with his girlfriend, Okuni, but was exiled after killing the shogun who had taken her by force. As Kenroku spoke to Kathleen, he was struck by a sense of familiarity in her face, realizing with a shock that she bore a striking resemblance to Okuni. On the other hand, Yoshinaga, Brian, and Eureka gazed at the desolate camp. They discussed their next move and weighed their options. Shortly after, Eureka proposed that they venture to the secluded countryside of Niigata, surrounded by mountains. She explained that the area was sparsely populated, increasing the likelihood of encountering fewer gibiates. Hearing that, Yoshinaga agreed, recalling the research facility located in Niigata. Then they make it their next destination. After that, Yoshinaga tasked Sensei and the others with collecting gibbate stingers, as he needed a large quantity of venom to research a vaccine. He led them to the building where he kept his samples and hoped that the helicopter on the roof remained intact, as it could serve as a means of escape. As they entered the building, Yoshinaga enlisted Sensui and Kenroku to stand guard, as he suspected that gibbates could be lurking inside. They sprang into action, swiftly clearing the premises. Then Yoshinaga instructed the others to gather what they could carry and meet him on the roof. Shortly after, Brian approached him and asked if he truly believed he could create a vaccine. Brian shared the pain of losing loved ones and the hope that his research could bring some solace. Yoshinaga assured Brian that with Sensui and Kenroku's help, he had obtained sufficient samples to expedite the vaccine's production. As they assembled on the roof, Sensui felt a foreboding presence. Suddenly, they spotted a man who had collapsed on the roof of the adjacent building. The group quickly took off in a helicopter, intending to rescue him. But their mission was interrupted by a new type of gibbate, armed with supersonic waves. However, Kenroku was horrified to discover that this gibbate was not repelled by light, and Yoshinaga pointed out its unique abilities. They tried to flee, but the gibbate snagged the helicopter with its tentacles. Soon after, Kenroku took a leap of faith and cut the tentacles with his thread, but to no avail. The tentacles proved to be too strong to be severed. Just as the gibbate was about to strike him down, Sensui sprang into action, saving Kenroku from certain death. Then he swung his katana at the gibbate, but to his dismay, it instead broke. As the man who had fainted regained consciousness, he looked up and saw the helicopter hovering above him. He called it a bird and waved frantically, catching the attention of Kenroku. Then Kenroku quickly tossed him a cable and instructed him to pull it down. Finally, the man succeeded in pulling the helicopter closer, and Yoshinaga and the rest of the team jumped out. However, the victory was short-lived as Brian was injured in the scuffle with Gibbate, and Kenroku was still on the helicopter. Determined to take down Gibbate, he crashed the helicopter into the monster, causing it to explode. The next morning, the man who had helped them introduced himself as Onikara Yukino-jo, a warrior monk from Honganji. Kenroku and Sensui were familiar with his lineage and knew that he was from a time before them. As they ventured out to gather supplies, Kenroku and Yukino-jo remained asleep. Meanwhile, Kathleen recorded a video diary and shared her story. She told of her father, a war photographer from the United States, who was injured and cared for by a nurse named Eureka Funada. They fell in love and married, but her father passed away when Kathleen was only 4 years old. Despite the challenges she faced, including the recent Gibbate plague, she found solace in the companionship of Sensei, Kenroku, and the others. When Yoshinaga curing Brian's injured leg, giving painkillers, a shocking turn of events occurred. He suddenly transformed into a gibbate and lunged at Yoshinaga. Just in the nick of time, Adam arrived and put an end to Brian's rampage. The reality of the situation hit Adam hard when he heard the gibbate utter his name. It was indeed Brian who had been infected during the previous day's attack. The next day, Sensei was seen playing the shamisen, a guitar-like instrument. Kathleen, intrigued by the instrument, asked about it. Then he explained that he had found it on display and used to play it as a form of offering to the fallen, and as a way to pay homage to broken weapons. Kathleen's thoughts soon shifted to finding her mother, Eureka, who had gone missing. Sensei, who was determined to help, searched and eventually found her standing in front of an abandoned museum. As the group explored the abandoned museum, Eureka pointed out the former samurai exhibition, which held a surprise for Sensei and the others. They were shocked to find their old weapons on display, including Sensei's katana, Suigatsumaru, and his Western-style sword, halberd. Yukino-jo also stood in front of his weapon, reminiscent of his fallen comrade, Dozan. Kathleen couldn't help but marvel at Sensei, who carried both his swords with ease. Then he explained his background as a samurai who used both swords, with the Suigatsumaru being obtained from a rebel samurai and the halberd being a gift from his master. Suddenly, a commotion downstairs drew the attention of Kathleen, Kenroku, and Sensei. They rushed down to find Yukino-jo battling gibbates. With their weapons in hand, they fought off the attacking gibbates while protecting Kathleen and Eureka. Unfortunately, the rain only made things worse, as the gibbates seemed to be multiplying by the minute. Kathleen asked everyone to hold their ground, as Yoshinaga and Adam would soon arrive to pick them up. Sure enough, Yoshinaga and Adam arrived and shouted for everyone to run straight to the car. Despite the odds, they worked together to fend off the gibbates and make their way to safety. However, the toll of the battle was evident on Sensei, who was injured and exhausted from fighting with all his might. Despite receiving treatment from Eureka, Kathleen worried for him and asked him not to push himself too hard. Then Kenroku reciting a verse from the Imperial Advisor's poem when Eureka joined in, reminding him of the past encounter with Sensui. It was a time when he was forced to return from the war in Korea, and Kenroku was traveling with Okuni. At that time, they crossed paths on the street, and Kenroku immediately recognized him as the famous samurai who wielded 2 swords. Meanwhile, Matsumoto Jozan and his followers faced a dilemma as he had made promises to both the Eastern and Western armies. In the end, Jozan sided with the Eastern army, putting Sensui at the forefront of the battle against the Western army. After a hard-fought battle, Sensui emerged victorious. However, Sensui was not done yet. He confronted Kenroku, eager to engage in a fight with him. Then he swung his sword, cutting Kenroku's chain of Kusari Naga. But Kenroku was quick to dodge and strike back with his claws. After that, Sensui managed to block the attack, and they stood face to face, ready for another round. Shortly after, Kenroku spoke, stating that if they continued their fight, neither would survive. He promised Sensui that they would have their fight another day. Back to the present, Adam stood staring at the fallen U.S. Army souvenir necklace, his anger brewing within him. Suddenly, their car's tire punctured, bringing their journey to a halt and attracting the attention of the Gibeates. Sensui, still recovering from his wounds, was unable to join Kenroku and Yukinojo in battle, as they set out to face the incoming horde of Gibeate lizards. Sometime before, Kathleen had recorded Yukinojo's story with her camera. He spoke of his childhood, training as a warrior monk and the dream of starting a family. Despite never being with a woman, the thought of starting a family still lingered in his mind. Encouraged by Kathleen, Yukinojo found hope in the thought that his dream might come true. He declared that before that day came, he would protect Kathleen and the others. With hundreds of Gibeate lizards closing in on them, Kathleen desperately asked Yoshinaga for a solution, but the latter regretfully informed her that it was impossible to replace the punctured tire under the current circumstances. As the sun began to set, Adam emerged from the building and headed towards a herd of Gibeate lizards that were charging towards the bridge. Kenroku knew that Adam had been bitten by one of the creatures and was now undergoing a transformation. Despite this, Adam pressed on, determined to reach the lizards and save the others. Just as he reached the herd, Adam's transformation accelerated, and he collapsed. But before he lost consciousness, he remembered his past and the reasons why he was fighting. With his last bit of strength, he activated a bomb, sacrificing himself to destroy the bridge and the Gibeate lizards with it. After the dust had settled, Sensui awoke to find that Adam had given his life to save them all. Overcome with guilt and sadness, Sensui blamed himself for not being able to help Adam. But Kathleen consoled him, reminding him that Adam and Brian had given their lives for peace and that Sensui should not feel guilty for their sacrifice. As the group continued on their journey, Eureka sewed new clothes for Yukinojo, who gratefully accepted them. Kenroku couldn't help but tease Yukinojo when he saw him blush, suggesting that he might be falling in love with Eureka. This sparked memories for Yukinojo, who thought back on his childhood dreams of having a family and the memories he shared with his best friend, Dozan. In the late 16th century, Japan was in a state of turmoil as Oda Nobunaga sought to unify the country. When Kenyo, the head of a powerful Buddhist temple, refused to stop supplying aid to Nobunaga's enemies, the warrior monks declared war on him. In 1570, they managed to take over the Nagashima castle, forcing Nobunaga to retreat. 4 years later, Nobunaga returned with an army of 80,000 soldiers, determined to reclaim the castle. The siege was brutal, and the people inside were eventually forced to surrender. But instead of mercy, he ordered his soldiers to open fire on those who tried to flee. The castle was burned to the ground, along with the 20,000 civilians inside. Despite the tragedy, 2 young warriors, Yukinojo and Dozan, managed to escape. However, Dozan's injuries proved too severe, and he eventually died. Then Yukinojo took up Dozan's spiked mace and continued to fight against Nobunaga's troops, fleeing into a cave where he stepped on a puddle. To his surprise, his mace suddenly shone, and he was transported to the future. In the present, Kenroku jokingly suggested that Yukinojo should marry Eureka and start a family. However, Yukinojo took offense and playfully hit Kenroku on the head for his impolite words. But even as he blushed at the sight of Eureka smiling at him. A short time later, Yoshinaga led them to a rest stop, but their peace was interrupted when a group of armed men apprehended Kathleen. The leader of the group, Hanotami Renjiro, introduced himself as a member of the Galleon gang, escaped convicts who were now demanding their food supplies. At that moment, Kenroku was shocked at the idea of humans continuing to exploit and harm one another even in the future. But Kathleen bravely spoke up, declaring that Sensui was a skilled samurai and the galleon gang would stand no chance against him. There, Renjiro was unimpressed and challenged Sensui to a fight. With a single strike, he defeated Renjiro without killing him. Sensui showed mercy, declining to take Renjiro's life and explaining that he no longer wanted to kill anyone. Then the galleon gang retreated, freeing Kathleen, and Sensui and his companions resumed their journey. As they approached a dark tunnel, Yoshinaga warned that it was likely filled with gibbets, but they had no other option but to brave the danger. Inside the tunnel, they encountered the gibbets blocking their path, but Sensui and the others sprang into action, eliminating the threat. Shortly after, Kathleen stepped out of the car, clutching a grenade in her hand. With a swift motion, she hurled the explosive towards the wreckage blocking the exit, sending it up in a blaze of fire and smoke. But as she turned to make her way back, she stumbled and fell, with a gibbet looming over her, ready to strike. Just moments before, Kathleen had recorded Ranjiro. He introduced himself as the head of the Hatonomi Union, a small yakuza group. He shared that he had spent 5 years in prison but was released early due to the outbreak of the gibbet virus. The wardens were among the first to be infected, leaving the prisoners with a clear path to escape. As the gibbet approached her in the tunnel, Kathleen's mind wandered to her past. She remembered a time when she was a young girl, crying after tripping and falling. Her father comforted her, lifting her up onto his shoulders and telling her to always look towards the future, no matter what challenges may come. He reminded her that there was no disaster or war that would last forever. Meanwhile, as Kenroku raced to save Kathleen, he was suddenly confronted by a horde of gibbets. Yukino-jo and Sensui could barely catch a glimpse of her through the constant barrage of the infected monsters. But just when it seemed all was lost, a mysterious woman appeared, striking down the gibbet that threatened to harm Kathleen. With expert precision, she slashed and killed the monster with ease. Then Kathleen lost consciousness, and was transported back to her past in a dream. She remembered the day when she, her mother, and father went to the airport, with her father kissing her forehead and asking her to take care of her mother while he was away. Tragically, her father was killed by a stray bullet while on a photography assignment, leaving Kathleen and her mother to pick up the pieces. As Kathleen came to, she saw the woman who had saved her still battling the gibbets. She approached and thanked her, learning that the woman's name was Ayame and that she was a former police officer. Ayame immediately joined forces with Kenroku and the others, who were still busy fighting the gibbets. With relentless attacks, Sensui and the team managed to eradicate all of the infected monsters from the tunnel. Shortly after, Kathleen introduced Ayame to her mother, Eureka, and told her of Ayame's bravery in saving her. Then Eureka expressed her gratitude and invited Ayame to come with them to Niigata. At the same time, Yoshinaga also welcomed Ayame, saying that he would feel safer with someone as strong as her in their group. In the end, she agreed to join them and Yoshinaga advised them to quickly exit the tunnel and find a place to rest. Unbeknownst to them, Ranjiro and his crew were observing Sensui's fight and had come to the conclusion that he was not a normal human. As they were traveling, Ayame spotted a hot spring that she had visited before. During their bath, she confided in Eureka and Kathleen about her past. She revealed that her mother had been killed by gibbets, and that her father was a member of the Yakuza. Ayame initially didn't know where her father was, but she had become a police officer with the hopes of finding him. She later discovered that her father was involved in an incident that landed him in prison. In the men's bath, Yoshinaga advised Sensui to soak for a longer time to help heal his wounds. Then he remembered the same advice from his master and decided to take Yoshinaga's advice. When Sensui emerged from the hot spring, Yoshinaga and the others were shocked to see the scars covering his body. Then Sensui began to remember his past. At that time, when his family and his clan were wiped out by the Shimizu clan, he was adopted by a Western samurai named Halbert and raised as a swordsman. Halbert then becomes seriously ill and hands over his katana to Sensui. Sometime later, the Shimizu clan launches an attack on Sensui's territory, drawing him into battle. In the heat of the fight, Sensui impresses Jozan with his incredible abilities, leading Jozan to present him with the revered katana, Suigatsamaru. After the conflict ends, Sensui and his allies continue on their journey. Then Ayame steps forward, introducing herself to Kathleen's camera. She shares her unique heritage, with a Japanese father and a Chinese mother. Ayame's parents separated when she was young, and her mother worked at a relative's Chinese restaurant to support them both. It was here that she honed her skills in Chinese martial arts, wielding the tonfa with mastery. However, her father's association with the Yakuza ultimately led to her parents' divorce, fueling Ayame's desire to become a police officer and bring justice to a world where right and wrong are no longer clear. Meanwhile, somewhere, the Galleons gathered for lunch. They all complained, because one Galleon's member named Sakuma Hidenori was only making katsukare menus again. Suddenly, two Galleons members named Shishigai Guren and Hamuro Katsunori returned, reporting to Ranjiro their unsuccessful search for food and resources. With their supplies running low, Ranjiro decides to engage Sensei's group once again. Meanwhile, in the car, Sensei is amazed by the sight of a GPS device, as Yoshinaga explains its functions. However, their awe is short-lived as they realize they are being pursued by the Galleons. The two cars pull up beside each other, and Ayame is stunned to see her father, Ranjiro, in the opposing vehicle. Then Ranjiro orders his men to stop Yoshinaga's car, but as Guren prepares to shoot their tires, a surprising figure appears in the road. It is Meteora, formerly known as Gibiate, who had been previously hit by Kenroku in a helicopter. Yoshinaga has renamed her, and was shocked to see her standing in the middle of the road, transformed into a humanoid form. Suddenly, she changes shape again, becoming a T-Rex and attacking the Galleon's car, causing it to spin out of control. Then Sensei acted quickly as Meteora was about to wreak havoc on Galleon's car. He firmly told Yoshinaga to step aside and took matters into his own hands. He bravely stepped forward and managed to subdue Meteora. Kenroku and Yukinojo rushed to assist Sensei, with Kenroku using his strings to try and restrain Meteora. However, Kenroku soon realized that this Gibiate was much stronger than any he had faced before. Despite his efforts, Kenroku was surprised to see that Meteora was not consumed by the desire to sting humans, and that the Gibiate was still alive even after Kenroku tried to blow it up using a helicopter. Sensei was determined to defeat Meteora, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, in the car, Eureka approached Ayame, who was deep in thought. Ayame shared her desire to save her father, even if it meant his death by Gibiate. Eureka softly asked if Ayame would be okay if her father did not make it. Kathleen, who was listening in, confessed to feeling jealous of Ayame, as she still had a father to fight for. Then Ayame was haunted by memories of her mother's death, who was infected by a Gibiate sting. She knew she had to take action to stop Meteora and protect others from suffering the same fate. With the help of Yukinojo, Kenroku, and Sensei, she bravely stepped forward to join the fight against the dangerous creature. To their surprise, they realized that Meteora was attempting to communicate with them. With no other options, Ayame came up with a bold plan. She used the car to push Meteora into a nearby river, where the current swept the Gibiate away. As the fight subsided, Ayame turned her attention to her father, Ranjiro. She scolded him for his actions, asking him if he was not ashamed to attack and steal from others in a world already destroyed. She told him that if he wanted to fight, he should do so for revenge on the Gibiate that took her mother's life. Then she told him to leave and never show himself to her again. Despite their efforts, Sensei was feeling the effects of non-stop fighting and fell ill. Eureka suggested that they stop the car and take a few days to rest. Then Ayame consulted the map on the GPS and pointed to a food factory, instructing Yoshinaga to drive them there. Long story short, Ayame, Kenroku, and Yukinojo arrived at a place infested with Gibiates. They successfully killed the creatures and tidied the area for Sensei to rest. Meanwhile, Kathleen recorded her mother Eureka, as she spoke about her happiest and saddest moments in life. She revealed that the birth of Kathleen was the happiest moment, and the death of her husband was the saddest. She expressed her wish to die before Kathleen. Back in the present, Eureka was stung by a Gibiate, and Kenroku quickly killed it. Yoshinaga hoped that Eureka was only hit with an empty bite, as the Gibiate might have bitten others in the past 24 hours. Then he stayed behind to let Sensei and Eureka rest. However, Kathleen woke up to find her mother missing. After woke up, Ayame and Kenroku set out to search for food supplies and Eureka, leaving Yukinojo behind to care for Sensei and Kathleen. As she tended to Sensei's high fever, Kathleen stumbled upon a letter from Eureka. In the letter, she said goodbye to Kathleen and informed her that she wouldn't be able to stay with her until the end. However, she also encouraged Kathleen not to be too broken by her loss, reminding her that she had Sensei and the others to support her. She also believed that Yoshinaga would complete the vaccine and save everyone. Eureka promised to return if she didn't turn into a Gibiate in the next few hours. Shortly after, Yukinojo tried to comfort Kathleen and told her that since he arrived in the future, only her smile had the power to save him. But he didn't ask her to smile, instead he wanted to do his best to keep her from feeling lonely. He asked her to stop crying and shared a surprising discovery: how good the curry was at the supermarket. He pondered that if everyone had access to good food like that, perhaps they wouldn't have to kill each other in his time. Hearing that, Kathleen was stunned when she learned of the harsh reality that Yukinojo hailed from. In an act of kindness and protection, she gave Yukino-jo the amulet her mother had passed down to her. She meticulously sewed the amulet onto his clothing, making sure it wouldn't be lost. Upon receiving the amulet, Yukino-jo thanked Kathleen and informed her that its power had already increased his strength tenfold. Meanwhile, Ayame was consumed by guilt for not being able to kill the gibbate that had infected Eureka. Then Kenroku tried to offer solace, reminding her that even Yukino-jo must be feeling great distress. He urged her to hurry back and offered words of encouragement. As they made their way forward, they stumbled upon an abandoned car where they found Eureka, who was showing signs of her transformation into a gibbate. Shortly after, Ayame and Kenroku stumbled upon a supermarket and joined forces to defeat a group of gibbate lizards. Once the danger had passed, they ventured inside to gather much-needed supplies, such as medicine and food. Ayame's thoughts drifted to Eureka as she daydreamed, only to be interrupted by another gibbate lizard that nearly got the better of her. Then Kenroku quickly sprang into action, saving Ayame and killing the creature. He reminded her to stay alert and focused, as she had to remain strong to save everyone and wait for Sensei to recover, as well as Eureka's eventual return. Meanwhile, Kathleen and Yukino-jo heard a commotion coming from outside. They peered out to see a herd of gibbates making their way towards their location. Determined to protect Sensei, she was ready to face the oncoming horde. However, Yukino-jo quickly pushed her back into the building and closed the door. Furious, Kathleen pounded on the door, demanding to be let out so she could help fight. But he refused, insisting that the amulet she had given him would protect her. Yukino-jo then instructed Kathleen to make a new talisman in case Eureka returned. He brandished his mace and fearlessly challenged the gibbates to come forth. The scene then shifted to Guren in front of Kathleen's camera. He revealed that he was an orphan who had been taken in by Ranjiro. He explained that he had dedicated his life to protecting Ranjiro, even if it meant risking his own life. To better serve Ranjiro, who wielded a katana in battle, Guren honed his skills with weapons. He stated that a gun would be the ideal weapon against the gibbate, but unfortunately, he was currently out of ammunition. He also mentioned that Japan's strict laws against the free use of firearms contributed to its downfall at the hands of the gibbate. He was stunned to learn that the rest of the world had also been destroyed by the gibbate invasion. Back to the present, Ayame and Kenroku stumbled upon a heart-wrenching scene as they returned to their hiding place in the morning. Lying before them were the bodies of several gibbates. But what shattered their spirits even further was the sight of Yukino-jo, who had died while protecting Kathleen. As Ayame opened the door, Kathleen broke down in tears, clutching the amulet close to her chest and mourning the loss of her protector. To her surprise, Yukino-jo's death was not caused by the venom of the gibbates, leading her to believe that he may have still been human. On the other hand, Kenroku made a shocking realization upon noticing one of the gibbate corpses dressed like Eureka. He realized that the woman had returned as a gibbate, and speculated that Yukino-jo might not have been able to fight at full strength. The news sent Kathleen into a frenzy, causing her to scream hysterically as memories of her mother and her brief time with Yukino-jo flooded her mind. In an attempt to calm her down, Ayame comforted her and expressed how cruel the world could be, taking the lives of the kindest people first. Not long after, Sensei finally regained consciousness, and was informed of the events that transpired while he was unconscious. Overcome with gratitude, he approached Yukino-jo's body and thanked him for his bravery in protecting Kathleen. With Yukino-jo's death, Sensei and the others were now down to only 5 members. Nevertheless, they steeled themselves and prepared for the journey ahead, heading towards Niigata with weapons in hand. The next day, they finally arrived at the city and headed straight towards the building where the gibbate research was taking place. Along the way, they encountered various types of gibbates, ready to attack anyone who dared to approach the building. Sensei, who was initially hesitant to face such odds, rallied himself and his team, determined to see their mission through. Despite the setback of losing one of their own, Sensei, Kenroku, and the rest of the group stood firm. When they arrived at the building, Sensei and the others prepared to engage in battle. Suddenly, Galleon's car pulled up and to Ayame's surprise, Ranjiro stepped out with his crew, ready to lend a hand in the fight against the gibbate horde. Ayame was relieved to see her father had changed for the better, and the Sensei group now had new allies to rely on. Without wasting time, Sensei and his team sprang into action, using their diverse fighting styles to defeat the gibbate horde. In the end, they emerged victorious, having succeeded in wiping out the gibbate nesting in the building. Then Sensei thanked Ranjiro and his crew for their help in the battle. Meanwhile, Yoshinaga made his way to the gibbate research lab to continue work on the vaccine. As they celebrated their victory with a meal of curry made by Sakuma, They found peace in the knowledge that the lights from the repaired electricity generator would keep the Gibeates at bay, ensuring they could rest easy through the night. When the sun rose over the ocean, Meteora reappeared outside the building, her gaze fixed upon its walls. Ayame took charge, brandishing her shotgun, and woke the others with a sense of urgency. Meteora had come to their doorstep. Shortly after, Sensui and the group quickly armed themselves with various weapons, determined to protect themselves and their home. However, their efforts proved to be in vain, as Meteora proved to be too powerful to defeat. Despite their attacks, she remained steadfast, showing no intent to harm them. To their surprise, Meteora eventually left the building, heading straight for Dr. Yoshinaga. Then Sensui and the others followed, eager to confront Meteora. Kenroku, ever resourceful, launched a barrage of bombs in her direction. The impact was devastating, sending her flying out of the building and ultimately leading to her demise. It was then that Yoshinaga made the breakthrough they had been hoping for. He had found a vaccine that would cure Gibeate and turn the infected back into human form. As Yoshinaga stood over Meteora's lifeless body, his sadness was palpable. Sensui and the others were caught off guard as Yoshinaga revealed his true identity. He was not from Earth, but from another planet. He shared that he had been a student of Meteora's father and, to their surprise, her boyfriend. The tragedy began when Meteora consumed the Gibeate, a substance believed to grant immense strength, which was revered as a gift from the gods on their planet. But the substance was incompatible with her body, turning her into a monster. Soon after, Yoshinaga and his mentor worked tirelessly to find an antidote, but their efforts were cut short when Meteora's father died in a conflict over the Gibeate. To protect Meteora, he took her away from the planet, using a flying capsule. However, the capsule was damaged during the journey, causing the Gibeate substance to turn into a virus on Earth and Meteora to crash in Europe. Meanwhile, Yoshinaga landed in Japan, where he eventually met Kathleen and the others. With Meteora gone, Yoshinaga's anger and frustration boiled over. He felt that all his efforts had been in vain, and he vowed to make those responsible pay. He took out his rage on Ayame, infecting her with the virus and watching as she turned into a monstrous Gibeate, slaughtering the rest of Ranjiro's crew. Sensui was forced to take action, beheading Ayame to put an end to the massacre. In a moment of madness, Yoshinaga injected himself with an even more powerful strain of the Gibeate virus. He was determined to avenge Meteora's death, even if it meant betraying his promise to save the Earth and turning it into a nest for Gibeates. With intelligence and the ability to speak still intact, he now posed a deadly threat to Sensui and Kenroku. They prepared for a fierce battle, but even Sensui's legendary Sugatsumaru katana was no match for his tough, mutated form. As the fight against Yoshinaga seemed to be reaching its end, a glimmer of hope appeared in the form of Kathleen. Armed with a stun gun, she made her way to the battlefield to assist Sensui and Kenroku. However, the unexpected happened as the stun gun only served to further mutate and strengthen Yoshinaga. In a shocking revelation, Yoshinaga explained that the arrival of Sensui, Kenroku, and Yukino-jo in the future was the result of the fragments of his flying capsule transforming into comets before landing on Earth. Kathleen, who had made a wish on a comet she saw, was filled with guilt as she realized her request had brought Sensui, Kenroku, and Yukino-jo to the future, leading to their suffering and Yukino-jo's death. Just when all seemed lost, Ranjiro stepped in to lend his support. He handed Sensui his katana and charged at Yoshinaga, sacrificing himself in a final act of revenge for the loss of Ayame and his crew. As the battle with Yoshinaga came to an end, Sensui and Kenroku emerged victorious, though not without cost. Sensui had been injured, receiving a deadly sting from Yoshinaga during the fight. Despite Kathleen's offer of a safe escape on her ship, Sensui refused, knowing the potential dangers posed by the Gibeate virus. He didn't want to risk endangering Kathleen and Kenroku. With heavy heart, Kathleen watched as Sensui stayed behind to face the Gibeates alone. She understood his decision, but couldn't help feeling sadness at the thought of losing him. She held on to hope that Sensui would survive and they would be reunited one day, and the anime ends. The moral lesson of this anime is about the simple yet effective steps we can take to keep ourselves and those around us healthy, such as washing our hands frequently and maintaining a clean environment.